Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, Distinguished Professor of Marketing at Emory University, one of the top thinkers in management, marketing, and leadership, and author of over 20 books such as The 4 A's of Marketing and The Rule of 3. This lecture is part 1 of the Rise of Chindia series and focuses on the paradigm shift.
This presentation really looks into the future and will speculate almost or articulate what is likely to happen in the next 30 to 50 years. And by the way, China and India is also now coined as a new phrase called Chindia. We'll get used to that new vocabulary called Chindia, and therefore the rise of Chindia and its impact on the world is what I'm going to focus today. The first major thing that I would like to talk about is a fundamental shift that is taking place in front of our eyes from the way the world got organized in the 20th century to the way the world is getting reorganized in the 21st century. And it is a two-dimensional shift. The first dimension is more and more ideology is giving way to market forces. Now, this does not sound right because of the strong counter-reaction that we see out in the marketplace, such as anti-globalization protest at any of the major WTO or World Bank get-togethers, such as, for example, the G8 summit meetings, or even the rise of ideological groups counter-reacting to globalization. But I need to separate market forces from globalization. I do believe that more and more the economic behavior of the countries and the world will be driven by market reforms, or what the economists call free market processes. And the reason for that is that ideology-driven world, especially in the second half of last century, simply bankrupted nations and it failed. So that's one dimension, there's a fundamental shift. The second dimension, equally powerful, if not more, is that the last century was driven primarily by what we call advanced nations or advanced economies. And that included obviously countries like the European Union, as we call it today, or individual countries like Germany, France, United Kingdom. Obviously the rise of America all of last century, and especially its becoming super economic power in the second half after World War II, and also the rise of Japan after World War II. These advanced countries primarily were the economic backbone of the world, and that is going to shift enormously, is shifting actually where the next economic front is likely to arise from more and more emerging nations. So if you imagine emerging economies being driven by market forces as opposed to ideology or monarchy or religion, is a powerful, potent new force arising where two countries leading that force are China and India. Hence this presentation, which is called The Rise of China and India, or Chindia, and its impact on the world. Why is this happening? Let's analyze that as to why this is happening. There are many forces out there suggesting this shift, but I'm going to focus only on 4 of them, sort of the 4 most critical ones. The biggest force turns out to be aging of all affluent nations. And this aging phenomenon is occurring sooner than expected, is occurring faster than expected, essentially, by all the demographers of the world. For example, Sweden is the oldest nation in the world, but Sweden is a tiny little country, good lead indicator, but its impact was not that great on the world economy. But the second oldest nation is Japan. And if you analyze Japanese economy, it is absolutely interesting to find out that in Japan, the absolute count of men is declining every month, and there is no way they can reproduce themselves as a nation. Japan also, as an economy, has remained very homogeneous. Immigration was not encouraged or allowed, for that matter, even from neighboring countries such as South Korea, for example, or mainland China. And therefore, Japan as a homogeneous society, unfortunately, has been aging much faster than we realized. And the same phenomenon is happening in Germany, where again, for the first time, the absolute number of deaths surpassed the number of births in the country. That is not aging as rapidly as Japan because it did have some immigration, especially from neighboring Middle Eastern countries, for example, or from, in fact, southern European countries, by and large, such as Italians as guest workers, or Kurdistan, Kurd people settling there to a while. But again, it is such a small component of the total population that, again, lack of immigration has been aging the nation, by and large. But this is not limited to Japan and Germany. It is happening to all other countries. In fact, the biggest surprising factor I found is that the lowest birth rate today is in all of the Mediterranean countries, what are called the Roman Catholic countries, where one did not expect them, such as, for example, the lowest birth rate is in Spain, second lowest birth rate is in Italy. Back to the Japanese story. In Japan, I came to realize this phenomenon by suddenly watching a new technology, which is really a system of maybe more than 200 manufacturers and service providers together, using the domestic market, creating a global standard, which is called the Smart Toilet Project. By the way, this is in the same league as the rise of HD TV, where Japan used its domestic market to create a world standard or a global standard. Same as what happened before that one with VCR, where both the Americans and the Europeans lost it and the Japanese became the de facto standard. I see the same thing happening going forward, maybe 20 years from now, roughly. What is a smart toilet? It is deployed in millions of units in the Japanese families. So I asked a question, what does it do? And the answer was, it does everything, you just sit there. It washes you, dries you, cleans you, but it also takes your blood pressure and a heart rate. Now it gets a little more interesting. Again, I said, why? I mean, typical innocent child question, why are you doing this stuff? And the answer is very simple. In Japan, people don't age in nursing homes or hospitals as they do in northern European countries or in North America. They age at home. It is the family obligation to take care of their older aging parents, and they age at home. Now, there is no way you can have the doctors or the nurses to come daily. And the aging is not a sudden dropping dead. It is a chronic diseases. It lingers forever. It is a multi-year phenomenon, aging in place. 4 or 5 chronic diseases such as hypertension, arthritis, diabetes, etc. are the key drivers in the process. So what you need is a daily monitoring and control, and the Japanese are using more and more technology because really they don't have the people to take care of that. Very interesting phenomenon. So the lead nation we have to watch is what is happening in Japan in terms of economic growth, in terms of technology coming out. And of course, because of this aging of affluent nations, one of the strongest problems governments are facing is the healthcare costs. In most countries today, the budget set aside for healthcare today exceeds budget set aside for military as well as, in fact, education. As you know, in the rest of the world, healthcare and education are pretty much central government free services provided to the society, and healthcare costs are just rising. In the US, where we have a private practice, as well as, in fact, we have an insurance mechanism where employers pay for the healthcare, we are having a massive crisis because of the aging population and the rising healthcare costs. Let me give you some numbers up front and then talk about how critical this problem is creating. It is almost like a tsunami about to happen. In 1980, healthcare was only 9.5% of GDP in America. In 1990, it became 12.5%. And remember, economy in America has been growing at the same time pretty significantly. And by the year 2000, it is going to be about 14.5% roughly. And by 2020, it'll be as much as 20% of the total GDP, which would be probably about $20 trillion. 20% of that one, we're talking about a $4 or $5 trillion cost to the economy in general. So here are the casualties. No large corporation, such as an automobile manufacturers like General Motors or Ford, or large service providers such as telephone companies who had large employees in the earlier days, can therefore survive. Airlines the same way. The pension plan obligations of retirees cannot be funded by new employees because new employees are displaced by more and more automation. Have you today gone to a typical factory in car assembly? It is all robotics done. Same thing today, if you go to a telephone company, the switches are working by themselves. Calls go automatically. There are no operators to connect you anymore. So the new employee coming into the workforce for the company or the industry whose pension plan money could support retirees simply is not possible. And in airlines, therefore, quite often taken the refuse into what is called Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection to renegotiate with the unions that this obligation is just not sustainable. Or you begin to shift that obligation to the government, and the government simply says, we have no money either. In fact, so far, the Social Security, which is anticipated to be in trouble by 2040, 2045, in fact, the numbers are a little better than for corporations. At General Motors or Ford, for example, for 8 or 9 retirees today, they probably have only 1 new employee coming into the workforce. Whereas in Social Security, at least, for 1 retiree, there are at least 8 or 9 new people coming into the workforce, which means new employment is absolutely critical in a country. And that is not happening in most advanced countries. The net new jobs creation is not happening as much, especially in Japan, especially in all of Europe, for example. US is slightly the exception, and the reason is that we have the whole new industries arising mostly in services sector, where people are outsourcing all of the homemaking activities. In fact, I wrote an article several years ago with a colleague of mine with a title called Outsourcing Comes Home. The idea was that while we are focusing quite a lot about corporations outsourcing work to other nations, whether it's manufacturing or call centers, the real outsourcing is taking place in America, where families, because of the dual income working households, are permanently giving up doing things like cooking, cleaning, and childcare, generating billions of dollars of new industries altogether, although they are not as yet Fortune 500 companies because they are all mom and pop, unorganized sector. But think about the same way 100 years ago when there was no automobile industry. There were mom and pop automobile makers. And suddenly it got organized into very large corporations. We see the same thing happening in services sector, such as, for example, childcare, such as, for example, eating out restaurants more and more, such as, for example, laundry, commercial laundry, or household laundry, and all that stuff by and large. But that is a very unique American phenomenon. It is not worldwide phenomenon among all advanced aging economies, which says economic growth is likely to come more from emerging economies, not from advanced economies. A second point I wanted to mention is that there is also a rise in what I call economic pragmatism. More and more the governments learned, especially after the first energy crisis of the 70s, that what matters to citizens in any democratic elections is not ideology, is not foreign policy, as strictly economic aspects of daily living. Are you able to, as a politician, are you able to promise me at least that you will have my jobs, fill my stomach as I call it, and are you able to promise me that you will fill my wallet, which is the wealth creation, through, let's say, tax reduction, for example, whatever the policies are, investment into stock market, however you create your wealth. Unless you carry out strong economic reforms or become more and more market-driven or economics-driven, as politicians, you are not going to survive. And we saw very clear evidence of this one. And I have a book that I just finished writing called Tectonic Shift, the geoeconomic realignment of the globalizing world, not necessarily geopolitical. And the whole book actually shows you how this economic pragmatism has become a reality in all countries of the world, not just in advanced countries. So here's the first example. The most popular president was not Ronald Reagan or President Kennedy or Roosevelt, which we think about, but turns out to be as late as 1991, George Bush Sr. Because in the first Gulf War, when Iraqis had attacked Kuwait, America was asked to save the nation, and we did a good job. World praised America. That was a noble gesture. That is what a superpower is supposed to do, to bail out countries in crisis. Popularity of George Bush rose enormously. 1991 was the peak popularity, higher than Reagan popularity, but 1992, he's out of a job, because we had economic recession in America. And what was the platform for the incumbent, for the newcomer who won against the incumbent called Bill Clinton? First of all, nobody knew Bill Clinton 2 years before. Out of nowhere from a southern state, Arkansas, one does not expect the governor of a southern state to rise to national politics and also to be winning the election. He did become the candidate of the Democratic Party. won the election and what was the campaign, his advisors had a very good phrase called, "It is the economy, stupid." And Clinton survived 4 more years, got re-elected despite his personal indiscretion, because the biggest miracle economically created in this country, next to Roosevelt, for example, would turns out to be probably the 8 years of Clinton administration. 3-4 things he did right. First of all, he destroyed the complete bureaucracy of the federal government, downsizing it. Now, you cannot downsize when you have no economic growth. He also changed from welfare to workfare system. No more welfare. Massive change in the society, politically not sellable, but because he grew the total economic pie, everybody was happy. Allowed more temporary workers, especially in the IT field, where the quota was 60,000 workers. He opened up the quota to 250,000, and there was no public reaction because everybody had a job. Created more wealth for the rich people than ever before, despite taxing more. He removed all of the tax shelter mechanisms that were created in the 70s and the 80s. It clearly gave a message, what matters to the world is economics. And by the way, who was watching him? A very young rising politician in United Kingdom called Tony Blair, who admired Bill Clinton, and he followed the same practices. And guess what? In the last, again, almost 8 to 12 years of Tony Blair reign, UK economy is turned around beautifully. John Major was the incumbent, trying to get the benefits of all of the economic restructuring done by Mrs. Thatcher, where Mrs. Thatcher aggressively went toward privatization, liberalization. State should not own any businesses, restructure the economy, but all the benefits went to Tony Blair as a market-driven process. Again, it is not limited to United Kingdom. Same thing happened in Germany. The most popular, in fact, Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had longest surviving run, called Helmut Kohl, the biggest mistake he made was to integrate East Germany just prior to the collapse of communism on an equal footing, because in that case he would get number of voters coming in to vote for his party, which is a coalition. He wanted to make it into a majority party. And guess what happened? The German economy collapsed. From practically zero unemployment, it went to 10.5% unemployment, and immediately Helmut Kohl became the casualty. Schroeder government came in, and again in 4 or 5 years, he could not turn around the economy. He's gone now. And now Mrs. Merkel, as the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, has come in, and obviously, unless she turns around the economy of Germany, again, she's not likely to survive. Same message in France, in Canada, and by the way, same thing true in emerging economies. Whether it is Thailand or India, doesn't make any difference. Even all of the ex-communist countries who have become better capitalists than ever before, if they cannot continuously deliver economic growth, you are likely to see huge revolts, as it is happening in some of the ex-communist countries like Eastern European countries, for example. Economic growth becomes very key for the political survival process by and large. Third major point is that there was an alternate ideology, which is why we were driven so much by ideology in the 20th century. That ideology is gone, called collapse of communism. Communism as a strong alternative to capitalism just has not survived. Probably 50 years of that experimentation, and of course in Soviet Union from 1917 essentially, clearly convinced to the people that that is not the way out for economic well-being of the society by and large. That maybe capitalism or market forces are a better idea. And therefore, surprisingly, I find as I travel all over the world, the best capitalists today are all communist countries. And of course, the biggest one of them is China. And that's we are going to talk a little more about China as we go forward. But then little countries like Vietnam are doing exceptionally well. So is Estonia, for example. Just goes on and on. So the third major force that is now shifting from ideology to markets and from advanced economies to emerging economies is the collapse of communism. Because under communist, all these emerging economies had a different approach to economic growth, and they were basically stagnant. Think about Myanmar as a country, which is obviously more military junta, or many of the communist countries, they were just stagnating. But today they are becoming growth engines for the world. And as I mentioned again, the lead country and a very large country is China. In fact, China is destined to become super economic power in the process. Last comment and last point I want to make is that the world is getting more and more flat. In other words, the key difference between emerging economies and advanced economies has to do with infrastructure investment. Most of the emerging economies are primarily rural agricultural. How do you make them into industrial states or post-industrial societies? Fundamental enabling thing has been always infrastructure. If you look at the rise of America, especially after the Civil War and President Lincoln's policy, it was all about massively building infrastructure. So America does not have to export agricultural raw materials such as cotton, for example, or iron ore or coal, but forces the manufacturing into America, for which you need infrastructure, whether those are waterways, railways, highways, whatever it is. And the US has always done very well by building the next generation of infrastructure, such as the interstate highways, for example, or more recently, the air traffic. Passenger on the one hand, but equally good, in fact, the air freight business. Simply aviation industry being targeted by the government as an infrastructure. But infrastructure is not limited strictly to physical infrastructure. It is also information technology infrastructure. And that is where the world is getting flat. Today, it is equally possible, even in Africa, let alone in China or India, to put IT technology, especially mobile telephones. And in fact, today, the largest number of mobile users are in China, not in America or not in Europe. Second largest number is likely to be India, not Europe, not China, again, going forward. So IT technology, which is a new technology, information highway, has suddenly become a great enabler for these emerging economies to do things that were unthinkable without infrastructure. There is another infrastructure also getting organized called the capital markets, such as banks, a central bank, clearing houses, all the work's done automatically behind the scenes, clearing checks, clearing transactions by and large. That is being put in place also in emerging economies. So financial institutions for the flow of capital is also getting equalized. While highways may not be equalized yet, air traffic is getting equalized. Today, if you go to China and down the road in India the same way, the next generation of airports are built there. In fact, once you reach and go to cities like Shanghai or Beijing or Hong Kong, which has been more advanced, and when you come back to advanced countries, whether it's in Europe here, you feel like the infrastructure of the airports here is third class, third world. It is aging. It is not as modern as it should be. All the new infrastructures are getting the benefits of modern technologies at the same time. So all of that stuff says that this difference between emerging economies, their capabilities, potential is there, but how do you realize that potential is getting equalized, and therefore the growth will come from emerging economies by and large. Last area, which always is a bottleneck, these are called the factors of production economics: land, labor, capital. Of course, these countries have massive land, China and India, for example. Labor, of course, they have a huge population. And of course, capital markets are coming now. Infrastructure is being built. So the only part that is weakness is what's called management or entrepreneurship, but especially management of large enterprises. And there, what you find very fascinating is enormous management mobility worldwide. I am told that in India, the second largest applicants for corporate jobs are American resumes. More and more Americans are saying, that's where the growth is. I'm more than happy to go there for X number of years, either as an expat or, surprisingly, live permanently. And by the way, this is not American multinationals having business in India or China. This is the Indian companies or Chinese company wanting the American talent or advanced country talent by and large. Because here we have put those management practices in place. So given all that, the world is becoming more flat. It is not flat fully yet, but it is getting flatter and flatter in terms of the infrastructure primarily, which will therefore create more growth in the emerging nations. All of this also comes together when you look at a long-term history about economic growth. And the process is basically the same, except the geography begins to shift. 1800s, the growth primarily came from the European countries because of industrial revolution and strongly shifting the economies from agriculture, land ownership, monarchy to, in fact, more and more industrialization through the Industrial Revolution. Manufacturing came in. Both Germany and UK led the world in that regard. and United Kingdom, or Britain as we call it, became actually a global empire in search of resources, raw materials to feed into that factory. While they had the labor in place, and they invested more in that labor by making education free all the way to college or any level, investing more into creating educational infrastructure. So people who are illiterate become more and more literate, but they still needed raw materials such as iron ore, coal, cotton. And as you know, one of the largest suppliers of this material used to be America before the Civil War. That begins to change. After the Civil War, Americans forced now factories to be placed in America, build the infrastructure. This is called the post-Civil War Lincoln policy. Also, there is no population here in America, so they invite first wave of massive immigration, mostly from continental Europe. And they are the factory workers of this country, as opposed to Native Americans. And rest of the history, America creates an enormous growth. In the beginning, growth is usually export-led in the sense that you are making products here not only just to serve your domestic market, but also to serve the worldwide market. And therefore, you have global standards, global competition, all this stuff. And US became de facto the super economic power. While the history is going to be repeated the same way in this century with India and China. Today, the rise of India and China is moving the whole sphere of influence from Europe to America, America to Asia. Hence, it is often called this century as the Asian century, with two lead countries, with China and India, and of course it includes the ASEAN bloc. It does include Japan, it does include Korea, but the lead countries are going to be, surprisingly, not Korea and Japan, but China and India. And that's the story that I'm really talking about in this presentation pretty much. So it's the rise of the Asian century and why and how it is happening. First of all, there is a new statistics called purchasing power parity. In other words, given that the currencies are fluctuating, speculative, floating dollar was created by President Nixon in 1971. Since that time, looking at currency exchange is misleading. The real buying power may be very different than what the currency exchange tells you. You could have artificially kept a currency low priced for export purposes, as there is a lot of criticism about China keeping its yuan low priced relative to what it should be. Or if you analyze India against American dollar, the exchange rate would be, let's say, 45 rupees per dollar, but the real buying power is not 45 times less than America. It is only 4 or 5 times less than America. So if you create a purchasing power parity index, which what the world bodies have created, United Nations, World Bank, IMF, and everybody sort of looks at this index, you find very interestingly that under this index, larger the nation and more the buying power, it becomes bigger and bigger in size. So you see a conspicuous absence of advanced countries in the rankings such as Canada or Netherlands or Sweden. They are all advanced countries, but they don't have enough people. On the other hand, the ranking will be low for countries who have lots of people, but they don't have a purchasing power parity index in their favor. But two countries that are rising enormously, and there are more than two countries, I'll talk in a moment, are obviously China and India. So the statistics, which are 2005 estimated data, and probably the actual reality is even stronger in favor of China and India. Under this, US is $12.4 trillion economy. Under the GDP measure, it is about 11.5 trillion. China is already 8.2 trillion in 2005. Probably by 2006, it has already crossed about 9 trillion, or maybe close to 9.5. Japan 3.9 trillion, and India 3.7 trillion. India will definitely become the third largest economy. China will become the first largest economy, as I'll show you in a slide in a moment. But on this slide, you will also see a word called the BRIC report. This is the first definitive, pretty scientific approach to looking into the world of tomorrow by looking using econometric techniques. The world of 2050 report was created by Goldman Sachs. It is in an acronym called the BRIC report. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the conclusion of the report was that by 2050, all emerging economies put together will have greater GDP than all advanced countries put together. And 4 lead countries are going to be Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but in a reverse order. In other words, China up front. Right behind would be India, then Russia, and then Brazil, kind of a notion. And these four economies themselves will control, in many ways, the world economic behavior. But the two lead countries are China and India, and that's the focus of this presentation. So China is the second largest economy based on the PPP index, has just surpassed Japan by a long shot. It'll be the largest single economy by the year 2020. India is the fourth largest economy and will surpass Japan by 2010, and it will be probably sooner than that. And by the way, while PPP is one index, we will also watch the index called GDP. And my forecast is that even on GDP measure, which is a traditional measure, both India and China will become the largest economies among the top three economies. US still will be one of those three, but not number one. It'll be number two, very likely, and has a potential even to slide to number three position, depending upon what happens in India. India, as a democratic country, is going to have a journey not as well planned or forecasted. It is going to have starts and faltering kind of a thing. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, etc. It depends upon the political process. But China clearly has a very clear path, and it seems like there's nothing that anybody can stop from China emerging as the number one economy, with India number two potentially, although it's likely to be number three economy. Now, how does this look compared to another world that we all knew? There's an excellent book called The Triad Power, written by Kenichi Omai, one of the brilliant thinkers, a PhD from MIT, Japanese origin, went back to Japan as a consultant of McKinsey, advised all the Japanese corporations, but he wrote this first book called The Triad Power, and the numbers were absolutely surprising and shocking. This book and the statistics there were as surprising as the BRIC report by Goldman Sachs today. It showed a very different picture, almost opposite of the Goldman Sachs picture. 75% of the world trade, according to Kenichi Omai, was concentrated only in these 15 countries. And by the way, Japan is a late entrant after World War II only. But Japan did become the second largest economy, one of the largest export-oriented economies in the world, by alignment with the Americans. So 75% of the world trade was concentrated among these triad nations. 70% of the world GDP also was concentrated among these 15 countries. 12 common European countries, US and Canada, and obviously Japan. Problem with all these advanced countries, as we talked about, is that they are just not growing domestically. Exception being America, and that's because we have a massive second wave immigration in America. But also more fundamentally, as I mentioned earlier, this is the only economy where there is a huge, massive outsourcing of activities in the home front. And in the US, 65% of the economy is driven by the consumer sector. Only 35% balance is driven by the business and the government sector. And therefore, consumer economy and what happens is very key, and that is booming in America. So America is an exception really from otherwise what is the world reality. And they really have no economic growth to sustain either employment or, for that matter, political stability, as we already articulated about elections and how parties are changing. The only way to create sustained economic growth is to integrate with large emerging nations such as China and India. In other words, rather than trading among themselves, investing among themselves, each one of those blocks will have to find a large emerging nation as its economic partner and a very strong bilateral, not multilateral or global relationship. And that is the new articulation that I see happening. In fact, in our book called The Tectonic Shift, which I mentioned earlier, this was the main conclusion we drew, that all advanced countries will actually have a necessity to integrate, to partner on an equal basis with emerging economies. This is not the colonial approach, but this is totally a very different approach, because it is in the self-interest of advanced countries to treat these emerging economies as equal economic partners. And of course, if they are equal economic partners, it is also political influence at the same time. Economics drives politics, not politics driving economics, essentially, is the fundamental conclusion that we are drawing around here. and hence the shift from ideology to markets by and large, right? So here is the new triad power. US still remain as a dominant economy, and what you see is China in this triangle and India. India just signed a strategic partnering agreement with America. It's a long-term military alignment, has nothing with a nuclear deal, which is just one side element, but the two are going to be military partners. And as you know, once you have a military partnership, it cannot be changed very quickly. It is like a 25, 30, sometimes 50-year journey. India aligned the same way with Soviet Union in the 70s. And if the Soviet Union had not collapsed, even today, India's military alignment would have been with Soviet Union. This is a fundamental shift, very massive, very powerful than we have realized. So India and US are becoming partners economically. On the other hand, China has arisen without any really support from America, except America as a large market. China grew enormously. After the ping-pong diplomacy under President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, China decided to reform itself. Deng Xiaoping was the reformist. From a communist country, it began to become more and more capitalist country. And we have seen the Chinese miracle in the process. But there was no domestic market. Remember, in the beginning, you have to have an export market, just like what happened with Japan, just like what happened with South Korea. And America became, for political reasons, ideological reasons, as a recipient of Chinese goods. And today, Chinese trade is the second largest with America. Canada is still number one, about 400 billion. Chinese are about 200 billion. Third, very close third, almost neck and neck, is Mexico with the NAFTA architecture, about 200 billion also. But Chinese trade, unlike Mexican trade, unlike Canadian trade, is very imbalanced. 150 billion may be imported into America. Only 50 billion is imported into China. And given that, and most of that happened because it is not the Chinese brands or the Chinese products, but basically outsourcing of manufacturing done in China. As we used to do in Japan, as we used to do in Korea, Taiwan, or other Asian or Latin American countries, it began to concentrate more and more in China because China had the resource advantage. People, hardworking people, has a political process that allows companies to do manufacturing with more ease, less restrictions. So a lot of efficiency came in the process. Most of the brands that we buy in America are not Chinese brands, but American brands made in China. In other words, America began, for its own reasons, concentrate its manufacturing in one economy. And as you know, the journey began in China, right across from Hong Kong. Hong Kong became the gateway. And from there, rest is history, and they're called special economic zones. And all the east coast of China, coastal cities, have just boomed enormously. But that is not going to be the future. As you see US shifting its manufacturing more toward India, not just China, and in many, many industries that shift is taking place. Chinese began by manufacturing what one calls low-end products. In other words, products where labor is more important than knowledge or brain in some fashion, but more and more high-end manufacturing like aerospace offset because of the military alignment. Very high-end switches, such as of the telephone manufacturing companies like Lucent, Alcatel, etc. Making, in fact, things like routers and servers for Cisco, semiconductor chip design, pharmaceutical, that's very high end of knowledge. And that is where India is likely to be the manufacturing capital of the world. It is just beginning, but it is going to happen in a massive way, is my forecast. The relationship of China and America, unfortunately, is negative. The rise of China has not been friendly to the United States. You see enormous rhetoric on both sides, sort of a confrontational approach, whether it is in economic exchange, such as Chinese currencies yuan, whether in fact it is about, how much Chinese should be importing from America, whatever it is, I don't expect that relationship to become positive, at least in the short run, despite changes in political leadership in US, for example, or in China for that matter. I do see these two nations rising differently. However, China has made a public statement, and I believe that statement, unlike many of my colleagues, this will be what is called the peaceful rise of China, unlike the rise of Japan pre-World War II. The Chinese actually will, in their own self-interest, make sure that they rise in a peaceful manner, very similar to the rise of America. American rise, as you know, since the Civil War was very peaceful. While America participated in World War I and World War II, but that was because they were reluctantly asked to help. They did not go to war with people. They did not conquer other people's territories as Japan did, for example, or Germany did for that matter, called the World War II. I think that's a fundamental change. So Chinese will rise peacefully. US will be anchoring its own fate with India, positive relationship, negative around here. It's not going to be neutral either. US as the de facto super economic power will be therefore impacted by the rise of China. In a triangle, when both are positive signs, such as US-China positive, US-India positive, then there's a positive relationship between China and India by definition. It's called a consistency, a balance theory. Therefore, the new phrase that is being coined is that what if China and India get together, called Chindia? And if that happens, what is its impact on the world? Especially impact on the United States. This is the presentation I'm doing here. So far, I've just set it up for you. And the impact will happen into three areas. Because in the academic world, we have three different theories about globalization. One theory is called resource-based advantage, that a nation becomes superior in economic power on a global basis if it is blessed with abundance of resources, whether the resources are land and therefore industrial raw materials or agriculture, or the resources are people, or the resources are capital, or the resources are entrepreneurship. So resource-based advantage is one set of theories. Second set of theories is that resources are fine, but do the companies and the industries really have a competitive advantage? In other words, how do you harness your resources and make it into viable businesses? It's called global competitiveness theories or competition. So I'm going to analyze the impact of the rise of China and India in terms of resource capturing worldwide, where they are resource deficient and what they will do to capture those resources, such as oil or minerals, etc. How the Chinese and the Indian companies, like the Japanese and the Korean companies, are likely to emerge as global enterprises competing on a worldwide basis as a second area. And a third area that I'm going to talk about is that rise of economic power always leads to the rise of political influence worldwide, or what is called geopolitical influence. So what is going to be the influence of India as an economic power down the road? India was kept on the sidelines for the last 50 years, 60 years since it became independent. Now India is becoming in the center stage. China is already in the center stage. In terms of political influence, just to give you the power of this, today the most influential nation in continent of Africa, huge potential, resource rich, is no longer Europeans, no longer Americans, but it is China. China has more geopolitical influence in in Africa, also in all of South America, where again resources are in countries like Brazil, Argentina, etc., etc. India is moving the same way, especially in what is called CIS nations. These are the ex-communist countries around its border, the Central Asian economies, where oil is a major resource, for example. Its influence in terms of neighboring countries, its influence in South Africa is rising. So we'll talk about that as the third major impact on the world by the rise of these two economies combined together called Chindia.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of the Rise of Chindia series with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.